I didn't realise what it was until more recently, and now when I see what it is, that's why I think it's very important to preserve it.
Well, absolutely. It's a treasure, really.
Yeah.
It really is.
If you let them get up higher, right, rather than keep them cropped, then the foliage will be above the ground.
Well, that's right, and you would see the stones.
That's
yes.
what I was thinking myself,
Yes.
I'm an expert in stone circles, you'll have noticed.
Absolutely. Why not?
You'd have preferred if he was more involved in the shop work at
Yeah.
the same time. Right. But then you might not have had this, Teresa.
I definitely wouldn't have,
I mean, every page you open is just a wonder.
Even as each year goes past, I realise how precious it is, what a precious source of knowledge it is.
Whenever a place name is associated with St. Patrick, it's a pretty sure sign that its origins are ancient. But when that association involves a dubious story, it might well indicate that those origins are older still than the coming of Christianity in the 5th century. Take the name of the place that I'm in today, for example. Its Irish name is Anchumpu Jeshel, and it means the right-hand turn. And in order to connect it to St. Patrick, which those early Christian analysts were always anxious to do, they tell the story whereby Patrick, en route to Enniskillen, left a manuscript here and instructed his servant to turn right to go back to get it. The reason they might want to impose that interpretation on the name is that Anchumpu Jeshel, turning right, is also a reference to the movement of the sun and suggests very strongly that its origins go back to pre-Christian, pagan, sun-worshipping times. Welcome to Anchumpu Jeshel, the village of Tempo in the county of Fermanagh.
The sun is a welcome but infrequent visitor to Fermanagh in the month of October, so any worship you see in evidence around the village of Tempo tends to be of the conventional variety. Though you could be forgiven for thinking that there must be a strong atavistic streak among the local population who have in recent years erected a stone circle on the outskirts of the village that would do credit to their Bronze Age ancestors. But that is more to do with celebrating an ancient heritage rather than practicing it. No, the only remnant of paganism in contemporary Tempo is the name itself, proudly emblazoned on businesses and buses. But just behind the village, across the river, in the grounds of the Tempo Manor estate, there is, in a corner of a shallow lake, resplendent in autumnal tones, a tiny island, so overgrown these days that it's scarcely discernible as such, whose name, handed down through the generations who've lived here, is Tempo Deasol. That's what John Langham learnt to call it as a child, and he also learnt that the island had druidic associations. So here, I would hazard a guess, is the origin of Anchumpu Jeshel, the ceremonial pagan site that gave us the name of Tempo. It was John Langham's great-great-great-grandfather, James Emerson Tennant, who built the present Tempo Manor House, mostly designed by the celebrated architect Sir Charles Lanyon in 1863. I say mostly because it does retain elements of a previous abode that takes us back to the days when the Maguires held sway in Fermanagh. The branch of the Maguires that lived here in the mid-1700s had acquired a reputation for extravagance and living beyond their means. And the behaviour of a certain Colonel Hugh Maguire, in attempting to solve his debt problem, is said to have inspired the writer Maria Edgeworth to create her villainous landlord, Sir Kit Rackrent. What is it that he did that stands out?
Locking Lady Cathcart up in the yard just over here, and because she had an estate in England, and he wanted the deeds to the estate so he could add it to it. He probably needed it for gambling or something of such thing, but she would refuse to give it to him, so he locked her up. But eventually she gave in and told him where the deeds were, behind a panel in the house in England.
You should point out, Lady Cathcart was his wife.
Yes.
He married Lady Cathcart, right? Presumably for her money in the first place.
Yep. And also the other funny thing I think is amazing, he was an important man in the community, and in Enniskillen and things, in the different places he would have sat. Why nobody ever questioned why he had his wife locked up.
Was it common knowledge that this was?
Oh
the
yes,
case?
I think so. Yes.
Right. So he locked her up literally in this little
building,
outhouse
yep.
out here
For 3 years.
for 3 years.
Yep.
She survived actually to a ripe old age.
She
as
did,
far
yeah.
as I know, in her 90s or something
Yep.
like that.
Yep.
So he wanted the deeds to some property she had
Yes, it was
in
a
England.
big property in England, and he wanted the deeds,
Right.
and she wouldn't tell him. But eventually, she did tell him. And when he went over to England, and in his haste to get behind the panel which the deeds were hidden behind, he cut himself with his penknife and got lockjaw, tetanus,
And he died of that.
and that was the end of him.
Right. It's kind of poetic justice.
It was very.
Colonel Maguire, we're told, was adept at duelling, but less so at gambling, and he was fond of both. So by the early 1800s, the Maguire connection to the Tempo domain had been severed. Later occupants would pursue more peaceful pastimes, and at the beginning of the 20th century, John Langham's great-grandfather, Sir Charles Langham, spent a good deal of his time providing us with what is nowadays regarded as a valuable photographic record of life in and around the estate and the village of Tempo in the year 1900. It's an eloquent collection of contrasts, really. Two seemingly parallel worlds separated by a tiny river valley and a great chasm of social class. A chasm that Charles Langham's camera tripod straddled with apparent ease. James Emerson Tennant, John's great-great-great-grandfather, never got to live in the house that he built in 1863. But many another distinguished personage would have dined here and stood on the manor steps overlooking the lake and the sylvan splendour of the domain, which includes, by the way, the tallest tree in Northern Ireland, a Sitka spruce that may not have been much more than a sapling when Charles Dickens paid a call.
Well, I think Emerson Tennant was a very close friend to Dickens, and that my mother has some papers of connection with them and letters and things. And then also that in one of Churchill's speeches, he talks of the dreary spires of Fermanagh, and I think it's probably likely he was staying here and found it cold and dreary and damp.
So you think it's Lanyon's little
Yeah,
spires
yeah.
here? Seriously?
I think so,
Well,
yeah.
today, it was a wee bit drizzly earlier on, but you can imagine, yes, if on a bad day, Churchill with a hangover would have
Not like
so
the
he
experience.
stayed here
I think
as
so,
well.
yes.
And Charles Dickens actually stayed in the house
Yeah,
as well?
I think so.
Right.
I've attributed what Churchill unfairly dubbed as those dreary spires of Fermanagh to the architect Charles Lanyon. But, as you'll hear, quite a few other people, including the 19th century American philanthropist Sir George Peabody, also had a hand in designing the way Tempo Manor looks today.
My ancestor was a friend of Sir George Peabody, and when he showed Peabody the plans for the house, Peabody thought it wasn't grand enough, so Peabody gave him the finances to build the extra bit of the house, which would be the tower, the billiard room and the room above.
Was that added on extra?
That was added on
Oh, that's
extra.
why I see the date,
It's
1867.
1867, yeah.
Right, so the rest of it was a few years
Yeah.
earlier than that. So the tower, did the tower have a bell?
No.
No?
No.
But it was built as a supposed bell tower?
I think it's a folly.
Just a folly.
Yeah.
But I think that the prospect across the lake, looking up at the house, is absolutely beautiful.
It is very pretty.
Really, really beautiful. And
But originally also, so I'm interrupting, but when the house was built, the lake was a lake surrounded by sort of swampy weeds, so it wouldn't have had maybe the same attraction it has now.
The days when Tempo Manor could afford a small army of servants and gardeners to keep everything just so are long gone. So the timeless appeal of that lake, surrounded by landscaped domain and manicured lawns, not to mention, of course, the house itself, are what John Langham depends upon today to induce people to visualise it as a backdrop to their wedding celebrations or other private functions. These days, Tempo Manor has to raise the revenue to pay for its own upkeep. And it's partly with this in mind, I think, that John guides me deeper into the woodland, to view a tiny, long-abandoned structure that still retains an air of secrecy, centuries after it became obsolete.
this is an astonishing thing to come across all of a sudden. It's a very old building for a start off, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Have you any idea how old?
I think the Maguires built it in the penal times so that they could worship.
Ah, right.
And so I think it's a very small chapel.
So it's a small private
Chapel,
hideaway
chapel, yeah.
Hideaway chapel.
And the priest used to live up the road, so possibly, when he was going past, he would have had a service for the Maguires here.
Right. Because, during those times, as we know, they used mast rocks, they used all sorts
Yep.
of... But this is a purpose-built and beautifully built.
Yeah,
as
it
well,
is
isn't it?
very pretty, and it's
Yeah.
a very early cut stone.
Aye. I just love the arches as
Yeah.
well, the way they're done. It was done by a very fine mason, wasn't it? And was it? Do you think it was a single story? Just
So, yes, it's a single story, and I'd like to renovate it again and get it back.
Wouldn't
Maybe even have wedding services in it.
well, that would be something, wouldn't
That'd
it?
be small though.
Yeah. That's a pipe dream, is it, or do you think you'll?
Oh no, I
ever
think
manage to do it?
I think I'll get it done.
And done in the original, finished off in that
Just
style
like
as
it would
well?
have been originally. Yep.
That would be absolutely wonderful to do.
And it's not too big a project.
You could do collections in it as well, couldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Pass around the basket.
Yeah. Maybe even do the services.
Well, you could do that as well. You'd be probably entitled to do so.
So, something to look forward to in this place where so much time is spent on looking back. Tempo is fortunate in having at least two important chroniclers of its recent past. The one skilled in a newfangled technology, the other adept at an infinitely older art form. The remarkable book of Johnny McKegney, when we come back. Crossing over this bridge will bring you from the entrance to Tempo Manor Estate into the village itself. And right away, you'll be in what local people have always called the Diamond. McKegneys were building coaches and traps and carts and turning out high-class carpentry here some 30 years before the manor house had even been built. And from 1965 onwards, this is where Johnny McKegney ran his grocery shop. Well, this is where he was supposed to be running his grocery shop. But as often as not, as his wife Teresa will tell you, Johnny would be absent from his post, allegedly making some delivery up the country, all the while colloguing with some old fella, with mapping pen and sketchbook in hand, getting material methodically, painstakingly, for what would turn out to be his magnum opus. A truly remarkable record of a life well spent, reflecting Johnny McKegney's fascination with the history, archaeology, commerce and folklore of his beloved Tempo and the Fermanagh countryside around. One of the great joys of this book is that Johnny's work has not been processed and proofed and printed as a conventional book. This is a reproduction of what he created with his own gifted hands.
Well, listen, somebody gave me a copy of this a few years back.
Yes.
I don't know exactly when. And I remember receiving it and opening it up. And it was, at the time, it really impressed me. And I thought, when the more I looked at it, the more I read it, this is one of the most remarkable books I have ever seen.
In the beginning, when we started the shop in December 1965, there was a lot of older people living around here, and he was a real people's person, and he used to love chatting them, and they used to tell him stories, and he used to pull out the wee biscuit bags. At that time you could sell broken biscuits by the pound, and he used to pull out these wee biscuit bags.
Just a paper bag?
A wee white biscuit bag, and write the story down on it, and here they were lying all around the place, and I wasn't even allowed to tidy them up or anything. And then I bought him a book after Christmas came, and I bought him a notebook, and that was the start of it.
And I suppose after a while, people would know that he was interested, and they'd
everyone knew him. Yeah, everyone knew him.
Right.
And he would sail off out of the shop and leave me with the shop.
We're getting to it now, aren't we?
You're getting to it now, we're not going to kill him.
Okay. I mean, he was off doing books and doing all
Enjoying
all of
himself,
this,
and I was...
But I was going to say, Teresa, I was going to ask you, I mean, when did he get the time to do this? Because he was supposed to be running the shop at the same time. But he
dodged off every minute he could get.
Get away.
And I would be raging. And I'd be maybe further down the shop serving somebody, and somebody would come in there and way off. He could slip away ever so quietly.
Without you noticing. But he knew what he was at. In other words, if she sees me, I'll not be allowed to go out. But he'd be away doing this.
He would.
I mean, he wasn't away idling or going to the bookies or fishing.
Oh,
never. He was doing this here.
Never. He was always doing this. He was always...
Right. Did you have a hand in any of this? Did he share it with you as he was doing it, or?
He did. He shared it with me because he wasn't a good speller.
Right.
And I don't know how many times I spelled chapel for him. He could never remember whether it was L-E or E-L.
Right. So did you had to sort of proofread his stuff and make sure he got it right?
I think I did that printing there. I think it was me did that.
Did you do that beautiful
I think I did, yeah.
opera play? That's
I don't be, at that time I could do the italic, but I haven't done it for years now,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I did that. There was different wee bits and odds and ends he,
So he let-
allowed me to
He
do.
allowed you to do. That's what I was going to say. But isn't that a nice way of involving you in this work as well? You'd have preferred if he was more involved in the shop work as well at the same time, right? But then you might not have had this, Teresa.
I definitely wouldn't have,
I mean, every page you open is just a wonder.
Even as each year goes past, I realise how precious it is, what a precious source of knowledge it is to all the young ones coming up, because they used to come asking him for history about tempo and what it was like long ago. But it's all there in the museum for them now, because we're giving all the stuff into the museum.
I mean,
And then it's good, and that is.
it is. I mean, apart from it being a labour of obvious love on
Yeah.
his part, it is a formidable body of knowledge. I mean, there's
Yes,
an awful
it
lot
is.
of
Yeah.
anything from folklore
Absolutely.
to local history, every aspect of the history of the place you can imagine. He sadly died very shortly after
Yes.
this was published.
Yes.
He lived to see it published, at
He
least.
did. 5 weeks after it was published, he died. Quite suddenly, really, although he wasn't in good health. And I should have realised, but he had different times he'd gone into hospital very sick, but he always got over it and came home again. And,
Yeah, only 5 weeks.
and those 5 weeks, he was extremely happy. And somebody said, "Johnny, how are you?" And he says, "You see every cloud up there? I'm just sitting up there."
But he must have felt, and I'm sure you all felt, an enormous sense of achievement.
Oh, I felt
to see
very
this,
proud.
To see this
I
coming
felt
out.
so proud of him.
And all those hours that you were giving off about him in the shop when he was away doing it, nearly worthwhile, was it?
Suddenly worthwhile.
Johnny McKegney's book In the Isle to Go, first published in 2010, is now in its 3rd edition and may also be viewed in such august surroundings as the Library of Congress in Washington and in the libraries of Harvard and several other American universities. But there's yet another very tangible aspect to Johnny's legacy which is now on view to anyone passing through the village of Tempo. The inspiration for the stone circle can be traced back to the slightly oddly named Topped Mountain nearby. That seems to be a translation of an oddly non-distinctive Irish name, Mullynock, which means simply the summit of a hill. The name is most likely derived from the massive cairn on top of the mountain. In archaeological terms, the site of an important early Bronze Age burial. And in rambling terms, a wonderful vantage point whence to view vast tracts of Fermanagh and Tyrone in the distance. For both reasons, Johnny McKegney was fond of rambling in the environs of Topped Mountain, but I suspect he found the climb increasingly tough going. So he devised a scheme to bring some of the mountain a bit closer to home. His book contains an account of how the stone circle was built by fairy folk, but there is an alternative version which claims that it was built by tempo folk like Carol Graham.
He certainly had done his research because he had walked miles over hills and dales, and he had located some nice stones.
But he came back down from the mountain. And he said,
Something like that.
I've had a vision of these stones.
Yes.
The local people will say, is he off his head or what?
Well,
What was the reaction?
I
Seriously?
suppose it certainly was. And how are we going to get? I mean, because he was talking big stones,
Well, just look.
the tradition of giants' graves and different things.
Yes.
He certainly was talking big stones. He wasn't into something that you could put in a bag and carry down. So there was going to be a lot of prep work, and there was going to be a lot of work.
But the
just
point
even
is, I mean,
thinking.
but people said, they were willing.
Yes, they were willing, because
Right.
I suppose the idea was a lovely idea, an entrance to Tempo. I think that was a nice thought.
Aye.
I'm sure people are driving past and they don't really know, were they there,
Well, I can
X
tell you,
years ago? Or
I can tell you, I've been driving through Tempo for, well, I don't know, I'm sure 20, 30 years or something like that. And I couldn't tell you when they were there.
first noticed?
And I thought, were they always there?
Yeah.
And that's the thing about them, isn't it? Because they look as if they've been here
yes,
for a couple of thousand years.
I mean, they've blended well in.
So it's here about roughly 20 years, we
Yes.
reckon, just over 20 years.
Just over 20 years.
And it's only in
yes.
its infancy, because
Absolutely.
it'll be here long after you and I
I hope so.
Have to depart
I hope so.
the place, I'm sure. Oh, it will.
I hope so indeed.
Next 1,000 years. And there'll be all sorts of stories of how it got here.
Yes, it'll be
fairy
probably dramatised a wee bit more and a bit more added to it, but there'll always be the little people involved, I think.
Well, that definitely.
Yeah.
I'm not good at guessing weights, but I would imagine like some of those must weigh very near a ton.
Well,
or maybe more.
absolutely.
I just don't know.
Absolutely.
So you had a lot of help, and you had to get sort of heavy machinery to get them down from the mountain.
and got them strapped on, onto the back of some of the trailers and link boxes, and it was a fair, it was a fair descent from the hillside as well.
And it was all done by sort of voluntary labour and all the rest of it, just the community gathering around and doing
Absolutely.
it.
And of course the best bit is then to sit and have your tea and sandwiches sitting on the hillside looking around, admiring the view.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not unlike a community would have been doing about 3,000 years, 4,000 years
Yes.
ago. Let's build a stone circle.
Yes, and get on with it.
They didn't have JCBs and excavators and all the rest of it.
It was a bit more difficult, but...
Well, I've been counting them, there's 12 of them.
Yes.
Was that significant at all?
No, not in my memory. No, no, it was
just like a clock. In other words.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe it was easier to put them. Thinking about sort of almost the clock and the 12 sort of.
Well, now that the sun has just come out and you start to see the shadows, you think, I wonder is there any significance to how they were placed or anything like that?
No, I don't think it was as technical as that now.
You don't get out here in the summer solstice or anything like that.
No, and climb about ceremonies. No.